Christmas night, inside a jail cell in Russell County, Alabama, a man confessed to murdering a 5-year-old girl. He talked for 5 hours without being asked a single question, and when the deputy finally asked him why he had chosen that night to come forward, his answer was chilling. He said he wanted to get right with God before he was executed. Not if, before. A man already speaking about his own death like a scheduled appointment he was simply waiting to keep. He was right. On August 13th, 2026, the state of Alabama carried out that execution. What he had done to that little girl was so unspeakable that even he seemed to believe from the very beginning that no other outcome was ever possible. This is the story we are telling today on True Crime Web. Stay with us. Welcome to True Crime Web. Tonight we are going to trace exactly how far this case went, how many warning signs existed before the worst happened, how many chances the system had to intervene, and what ultimately happened inside a courtroom when 2 defendants were finally forced to answer for what they had done to a child who never had the chance to defend herself. Before we go any further, a word of warning. The details in this case are deeply disturbing. The crime committed against this little girl is among the most difficult subject matter we have ever covered on this channel. We are going to handle it with the seriousness and the care it deserves, but we want you to be prepared. If you are new here, please consider subscribing and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We read every single one. Now let us begin. To understand this story, you first have to understand the geography, because geography matters here in ways that go far beyond a map. Columbus, Georgia, and Phoenix City, Alabama, sit on opposite banks of the Chattahoochee River. A 10-minute drive separates them. A state line runs between them. Most residents who cross that bridge every morning barely register it. For them, it is background, the kind of detail you stop noticing after you have driven past it 1,000 times. Columbus is a military town, home to Fort Moore, the installation formerly known as Fort Benning, a city that has spent the better part of the last 2 decades trying to reinvent its identity around something bigger than its uniform. Phoenix City carries its own complicated history, a place so notorious for gambling, organized crime, and open lawlessness in the 1950s that the state of Alabama sent in the National Guard just to restore basic order. The river between these 2 towns has seen a lot of history. In December of 2021, it would see something that neither city would ever fully recover from. That December, string lights went up along both banks. Families carried Christmas trees through front doors. Neighborhoods smelled like pine and wood smoke. And in a modest rental home on the Georgia side of that river, a 5-year-old girl was getting ready for her first Christmas as a big kindergartner. Old enough now to be genuinely helpful with the decorating, old enough to have very specific opinions about where the ornaments should go, old enough to ask complicated, wonderful, impossible-to-answer questions about exactly how Santa was going to find her house. 12 minutes away, across that bridge and across that state line, a man was waiting inside a house he no longer lived in, a house he had specifically chosen because it sat empty, isolated, and unwatched. And somewhere in the days leading up to Christmas, a number was being negotiated between 2 people on opposite ends of a phone call. $2,500. For what exactly, no one outside that conversation yet knew. But investigators were about to find out, and what they found would shake an entire community to its foundation. Her name was Kamari Holland. She was born on November 23, 2016 in Columbus, Georgia, which means that by the time December arrived, she had just celebrated her 5th birthday. It would be her last. Those who knew Kamari reach for the same word, almost without exception when they try to describe her: precious. Her father, Kamari Holland Sr., used it again and again in police interviews, in courtrooms, in victim impact statements delivered years after he first had to sit down and try to find language adequate to what he had lost. Precious, not because it was a poetic choice, but because to him it was simply, factually true. Kamari was one of 8 children in a large blended family, 4 brothers, 3 sisters, a household that for all its complications gave her no shortage of people who loved her deeply and completely. She was especially close to her father's side of the family, people who describe a little girl who could fill a room before she had said a single word. Her cousin would later stand in a courtroom and tell a jury that he had never in his life met a child who smiled as often as Kamari did. At 5 years old, Kamari was doing exactly what 5-year-olds do. She was learning to write her name, forming each letter with careful, concentrated effort. She was counting past 20 and announcing each new number like a personal victory. She was drawing pictures of her family in crayon, bright and vivid portraits of the people she loved, taped up on refrigerators and passed around at gatherings as gifts. Her preschool teachers noted her enthusiasm, her eagerness to make new friends, a laugh that could apparently disarm an entire classroom without the slightest effort. There is a photograph, the last one taken of Kamari while she was alive, captured in early December of 2021. In it, she is smiling. That same unmistakable, undeniable smile that everyone who ever knew her describes. Days after that photograph was taken, she was gone. And the world that had been built around her, the family that had loved her, the father who called her precious, the brothers and sisters who shared a home with her, would never be the same again. To understand what happened to Kamari Holland, you have to go back further than December of 2021. You have to understand the fractures that came before her, the cracks in the foundation that nobody fully addressed, while there was still time to do something about them. Kamari Holland Sr. and Christy Cyple had separated, while Kamari was still a toddler, leaving her primarily in her mother's care. Court records that later became public paint a troubling picture of that household, one that existed well before the month Kamari died. Russell County Sheriff Heath Taylor would later confirm publicly that Christy Cyple had been on the radar of child welfare authorities prior to her daughter's murder. The specific details of those earlier concerns remain sealed, as they often do in cases involving minors, but their very existence tells you something important. Someone, at some point, had looked at that home and decided it needed watching. Neighbors who lived near the Cyple household would later describe an environment marked by frequent visitors at odd hours, a revolving door of unfamiliar faces that created, in the words of those who were close to the family, an unstable and unpredictable environment for a small child trying to simply grow up inside it. None of that changed who Kamari was when she was inside those walls. She was still drawing, still laughing, still counting down the days until Christmas morning with the full, uncomplicated excitement of a 5-year-old who had no idea anything was wrong. But the adults around her knew something was wrong, and the system that was supposed to be watching failed to connect the dots it already had in front of it. Perhaps the most consequential detail of all was the man Christy Cyple had allowed into her life, a man named Jeremy Williams. Investigators would later determine that their relationship was not simply romantic in nature. It was transactional from the very beginning, a dynamic that had, in the months before Kamari's murder, already begun shifting towards something almost too horrifying to put into plain words. And here is where this case exposes a wound far larger than any single family. Georgia and Alabama do not share one seamless, unified child welfare system. A red flag raised on one side of the Chattahoochee River does not automatically follow a family across it. Whatever concerns existed about Christy Cyple in the state of Georgia had no guaranteed pathway to the eyes of anyone watching on the Alabama side of that bridge. Jeremy Williams had spent nearly his entire adult life exploiting exactly that kind of gap, and Kamari Holland paid the price for it with her life. His name was Jeremy Tremaine Williams, born in Alabama in 1984. By the time he entered Christy Cyple's life, he had spent nearly 2 decades constructing a pattern of behavior that, in hindsight, reads like a detailed checklist of missed warnings, each one more alarming than the last, each one filed away without adequate consequence. In 2009, Williams faced his first formal child abuse charge in Phoenix City. The case moved through the legal system for 3 years, and in 2012 a jury acquitted him. Whatever happened inside that courtroom, it sent Jeremy Williams back into the world with no conviction on his record and nothing to slow him down. But 2009 was not the beginning, not even close. In January of 2005, more than 4,000 miles away in North Pole, Alaska, Williams's 1-month-old child died under circumstances that immediately alarmed every investigator who looked at them. An autopsy found clear evidence of blunt force trauma. When authorities asked Williams to cooperate, he refused to take a polygraph examination and refused to sit for a police interview. With no cooperation and no confession, Alaska investigators were left with no choice but to rule the manner of death undetermined, which is the official clinical language used for a case that everyone suspects but cannot yet prove. The file went into a drawer. It did not disappear, and Williams walked away. Between these two documented encounters with suspicion, Williams lived what appeared from the outside to be a quiet and unremarkable life. Some neighbors described him as withdrawn, a man who kept largely to himself. Others knew a different version of him, someone capable of sudden and unexplained bursts of anger that seemed to come from nowhere. Almost no one connected the pieces into the pattern that investigators would later assemble with devastating clarity. A man who deliberately and systematically sought out relationships with women who were raising young daughters, particularly women who were in financial distress. Women he could position himself as helpful to, as reliable, as someone they could lean on, long before anyone around them understood what he was actually after. Investigators would eventually conclude that his relationship with Christy Cyple fit that exact blueprint. Not a romance that went wrong over time, but a calculated approach that had been designed from the very first conversation. For nearly 20 years, Jeremy Williams had moved through 2 states, accumulated 3 documented incidents of suspicion and an untold number of undocumented ones without ever facing a consequence remotely proportional to what the people around him suspected he was doing. A not guilty verdict here, an undetermined ruling there, a cold case that stayed cold. By December of 2021, when Christy Cyple picked up her phone and began negotiating with him, she was not reaching out to a man whose darkness was a rumor or a suspicion. She was reaching out to a man whose darkness had been growing, quietly and unchecked, for 2 decades, and it was about to catch up with everyone in its orbit, all at once. On Sunday, December 12th of 2021, phone records that would later be obtained by investigators showed a series of calls between Christy Cyple and Jeremy Williams. These were not casual conversations between 2 people catching up. They were negotiations. The starting number was $2,500. By the time the calls ended, it had been talked down to $1,300. A mother bargaining down the price of access to her own 5-year-old daughter, the way someone might haggle over a second-hand appliance they had found online. That night, while Kamari should have been asleep in her own bed dreaming about Christmas morning, she was instead taken from her home and transported across the state line into Alabama to the abandoned house on 15th Avenue in Phoenix City. The same house Williams had once lived in, the house he had chosen specifically because it sat isolated and surrounded by neighbors who kept to themselves and asked no questions. Using his own cell phone, Williams recorded what happened next. Toxicology results, later confirmed in court by forensic pathologist Dr. David Russey, showed both methamphetamine and amphetamine in Kamari's system, substances that had been administered deliberately, according to expert testimony, for the purpose of subduing a child who was 5 years old and could not have consented to any of what was being done to her. After hours of sexual assault, Williams killed her. The cause of death, in Dr. Russey's clinical courtroom language, was asphyxia due to ligature strangulation. In plain words, he took away her ability to breathe until her body stopped. Even that was not the end of what he did. Forensic evidence would later demonstrate that Williams continued to assault her after her death, and that he recorded that as well, evidence that would result in an additional charge of abuse of a corpse being added to an already incomprehensible list. Afterward, Williams locked the house, disposed of anything that might carry DNA, and returned to his own home. By every account in the investigative record, he did this calmly, methodically, with the quiet efficiency of a man finishing a task. Somewhere in Columbus that same night, Kamari's family was beginning to wonder where she was. Christy Cyple did not report her daughter missing that night. She waited, and when she finally picked up the phone the following morning, she had a story ready. At 6:15 in the morning on December 13th, 2021, Christy Cyple called the Columbus Police Department. Her voice, officers would later recall, carried what sounded like a mother's panic. She told them she had put Kamari to bed around midnight, that she had woken up around 5:50 in the morning, and that when she checked on her daughter, she found the bed empty and the front door standing open. A stranger, she implied, an intruder, the nightmare that every parent's mind goes to in the dark. It worked at first. Columbus police treated the call exactly as it had been presented, a possible child abduction, and they moved fast. Officers canvassed the surrounding neighborhood. K-9 units worked to pick up a scent trail. Volunteers moved through wooded areas and along drainage ditches. Cyple appeared in front of news cameras, tearful, describing Kamari as the essence of her life.
She had a heart. She had a spirit that she's been here before.
And then the day after her daughter's body was found in a Phoenix City basement, Christy Cyple showed up at a local television station's annual toy drive and donated Kamari's toys. Take a moment with that. A mother, less than 24 hours after her murdered 5-year-old daughter's body had been discovered, standing in front of cameras, handing over that child's toys to strangers, while continuing to tell anyone who would listen that she had no idea what had happened to her little girl.
I'm Kamari Holland's mommy, and she wouldn't want nothing in the world but to donate her toys to another little child that was in need because she was a very healthy child.
Behind the scenes, her phone records were already composing a very different story than the one she was performing for the cameras. And that story was about to find her. It was not grief. It was not even a performance of grief. It was, as investigators would later prove, a calculated act carried out by a woman who already knew exactly where Kamari was and exactly what had been done to her because she was the one who had made it possible. The break came from a lead provided by Jeremy Williams' own wife, a detail that pointed Columbus investigators toward the abandoned house on 15th Avenue in Phoenix City. By late afternoon on December 13th, the investigation had crossed the state line. Columbus police coordinated with the Russell County Sheriff's Office, and a team that included Sergeant Jane Edenfield made their way to the vacant property. The house was exactly as Williams had left it, mildew on the walls, dust thick enough to hold a footprint. No working lights except the beams the officers carried in with them. What those beams found inside that basement stopped hardened, experienced law enforcement officers cold. Sergeant Edenfield was among the first through the door. She was among the first to see Kamari Holland's small body, bearing every sign of what had been done to her in the hours since she had last been in her own bed. It was 11:15 at night. Less than 18 hours had passed since Kamari had been reported missing. A search for a lost child had become a murder investigation. By the following morning, Jeremy Williams was in custody at a Phoenix City hotel. The arrest was quiet, almost anticlimactic, a strange stillness surrounding a man who was about to be connected to something so violent. But the investigation was not finished. It was only just beginning to reveal how far the betrayal of this little girl had truly reached. As investigators worked through Williams's phone records and the communications between him and Christy Cyple, the story she had given police the morning of December 13th did not simply crack under examination. It collapsed entirely. There was no intruder. There was no stranger who had slipped through an unlocked door in the middle of the night while a mother slept. Christy Cyple had negotiated the sale of access to her own 5-year-old daughter to a man with a documented and known history of violence against children. She had done it by phone. She had done it over multiple calls, and she had bargained the price down. And here is the detail that makes this betrayal almost impossible to fully comprehend. Jeremy Williams never actually paid her. $2,500, negotiated down to $1,300. And by every account contained in the investigative record, that money never changed hands. Christy Cyple sold access to her own child and did not even receive the reduced amount she had agreed to accept. There is no framework that makes that fact less devastating. If anything, it strips away any remaining possibility that what she did was the act of a desperate mother making a catastrophic choice under financial pressure. A parent in genuine crisis is a tragedy that investigators encounter with painful regularity. A parent who hands her child to a predator and walks away with nothing at all is something fundamentally different. It is not a story about desperation reaching its breaking point, It is a story about a 5-year-old girl who was failed not by a stranger, but by the very person who was supposed to be her first and most complete protection in the world. On Christmas night of 2021, 12 days after Kamari's murder, Jeremy Williams sent word that he wanted to speak with Lieutenant Steve Johnson, the officer in charge of the Russell County Jail. He was ready, finally, to talk about the 5-year-old girl whose face had likely followed him through every one of those 12 days. What followed was a 5-hour confession in which Williams admitted, in considerable detail, to everything he had done to Kamari Holland in that abandoned house. And then, without being prompted, without anyone asking him to go further, he kept talking. He confessed to the death of his own 1-month-old child in Alaska in 2005, the case that had gone cold 16 years earlier because he had refused to cooperate with a single investigator who approached him. His own words, voluntarily given on Christmas night in an Alabama jail cell, reopened it. When Lieutenant Johnson asked him why he had chosen that particular night to come forward, Williams gave the answer that frames this entire story. He wanted to get right with God before he was executed. It is worth sitting with how profoundly strange that framing is. Most people who face a potential death sentence spend years, sometimes decades, in active legal combat against it. Jeremy Williams, less than 2 weeks after murdering a 5-year-old girl, was already speaking about his own execution, not as a fear to be resisted, but as a timeline he was preparing to meet. And he was not wrong. On August 13, 2026, the state of Alabama made good on the sentence that Judge David Johnson had handed down. That confession, taken together with the forensic evidence recovered from the scene, the cell phone footage Williams had recorded of himself, and the phone records documenting every negotiation between him and Christy Cyple, gave investigators a case that in the most literal possible sense could not be denied. In March of 2022, a Russell County grand jury returned indictments against both Jeremy Williams and Christy Cyple. Williams faced 8 separate charges, including 4 counts of capital murder: murder of a child under the age of 14, murder during a kidnapping, murder during a rape, and murder during sodomy. Under Alabama law, any one of those 4 charges alone was sufficient to carry a death sentence. He was also charged with human trafficking, production of obscene material involving a child, and abuse of a corpse. Cyple's charges were nearly as severe, including felony murder and sex trafficking, charges that also carried the possibility of the death penalty in Alabama. On March 13, 2024, more than 2 years after Kamari's murder, both defendants made their decisions. Williams entered what is known as a blind guilty plea, meaning he accepted no deal, negotiated no reduction in charges, and simply stood before the court and admitted his guilt to capital murder and the related offenses. When the judge asked him directly why he would choose to plead guilty, knowing that it could result in a death sentence, Williams said simply that he wanted to expedite the process. That same day, Christy Cyple accepted a plea agreement of her own, pleading guilty to sex trafficking in exchange for the murder charges being dropped and facing a maximum of 20 years in prison rather than the possibility of execution. Because Alabama law requires that a jury be empaneled before a death sentence can be imposed, even following a guilty plea, the case moved forward regardless. On April 8, 2024, jury selection began. On the first day of testimony, jurors watched approximately 15 minutes of the video footage Williams had recorded of himself inside that Phoenix City house. Several jurors wept openly as the footage played. Court personnel, who were positioned in the room but could not see the screen, and who could only hear the audio, were visibly shaken. Experienced law enforcement officers who had worked the case stepped outside to compose themselves. Dr. David Russey's forensic testimony confirmed the cause of death and the presence of controlled substances that had been administered to Kamari to subdue her. And in what may have been the single most devastating moment of the entire trial, a 23-year-old woman took the witness stand and told the jury that Jeremy Williams had molested her when she was 5 years old, decades earlier, in Alaska. She had never told anyone, not her friends, not her family, not even her own mother, until an investigator reached out to her in the wake of Williams's Christmas night confession. When asked why she had kept it silent for nearly 2 decades, she answered in words that required no elaboration. She said she was scared of what would happen if she told. In his closing argument, District Attorney Rick Chansey described to the jury what he had personally witnessed on the night Kamari's body was found inside that basement. He described seeing a naked 5-year-old child in full rigor mortis in the dark. Once you see it, he told them, you cannot unsee it. He said he would never unsee it. The jury convicted Jeremy Williams on every count. Because Williams waived his right to have that same jury determine his sentence, it fell to Judge David Johnson alone to deliver the punishment. Judge Johnson imposed 4 separate sentences of death, sentences that Jeremy Tremaine Williams would not fight, would not appeal, and would ultimately meet on August 13, 2026, when the state of Alabama carried out his execution. 3 months after sentencing, Christy Cyple was sentenced to 20 years in prison for sex trafficking. On December 22, 2021, more than 200 family members and close friends gathered to say goodbye to Kamari Holland. Sheriff Heath Taylor and District Attorney Rick Chansey attended alongside the officers who had worked her case through some of the hardest days of their professional lives. Kamari's great-uncle stood before the crowd and said the only words he could find that felt adequate to the moment. He said that evil had entered their community. He said that evil had affected their family. For Kamari Holland Sr., keeping his daughter's memory alive became something close to a calling. In April of 2022, still trying to find the language for a loss most parents cannot begin to imagine, he spoke publicly about what Kamari's absence had done to him. He said that she was a piece of his heart, that losing her was something he could not even put into words, that it had simply destroyed him. He said that what he thought life was supposed to look like had been stripped away in an instant, and that it was never going back to the same.
A piece of my heart, peace of mind, just how I thought life was supposed to be, all that was just stripped away. It's never going back the same. Losing Kamari was just, I can't even put it in words. It destroyed me.
And on November 23, 2024, what would have been Kamari Holland's 8th birthday, Kamari Holland Sr. organized a celebration of her life. Not a memorial in the traditional sense, not a gathering built around grief. A birthday party for a little girl who never got to blow out her own candles. There were balloons, there was cake, there were stories about the 5 short, luminous years she had been given, told by people who loved her and intended to keep telling them for as long as they were alive to do so. In the years since Kamari's murder, both Georgia and Alabama have reviewed the ways in which their child welfare systems communicate with one another, or fail to. New training protocols have been implemented that specifically emphasize the importance of recognizing trafficking risks that originate within families, not only from strangers outside them, addressing directly the kind of systemic gap that allowed warning signs about Christy Cyple to remain contained on one side of a state line where the other side could not see them. Whether those changes will be sufficient to protect the next child in a similar situation is a question that only time and circumstances will answer. But the recognition that the gap existed and that Kamari fell through it is at minimum a beginning. Jeremy Tremaine Williams waived every appeal available to him after receiving 4 death sentences for the murder of Kamari Holland. On August 13, 2026, the state of Alabama carried out his execution, bringing the capital case to its final legal conclusion. It was a strikingly fast timeline by any measure, given that most inmates on Alabama's death row wait more than 2 decades before reaching that point. Williams had asked to move to the front of that line, and the state obliged. In Alaska, investigators had reopened prior cases following his Christmas night confession, including the death of his 1-month-old child in 2005 and the assault on the young woman who testified at his trial. The status of those matters should be verified against current official records at the time of publication. What no legal outcome, no execution, and no courtroom verdict can ever change is the most fundamental truth at the center of this story. A 5-year-old girl who loved to draw pictures in crayon, who was proud every time she counted past 20, who had just celebrated her 5th birthday and was already thinking about Christmas morning, never got the chance to turn 6. She did not get to finish the drawing she had started. She did not get to blow out birthday candles on a cake. She did not get to grow up. And the person who was supposed to make sure she did, the person who was supposed to be her first and most complete protection against everything the world might send her way, was the one who picked up the phone and made the call that ended her life. If this story has stayed with you the way it has stayed with us, we want you to know that that feeling matters. These are real people. Kamari Holland was a real little girl with a real smile and a real laugh, and real people who loved her, and still love her, and will love her every day for the rest of their lives. Telling her story, telling it completely and honestly and with the seriousness it deserves, is one of the reasons TrueCrimeWeb exists. If you believe that stories like this one need to be heard, please hit the like button, leave a comment below, and let us know your thoughts, and make sure you subscribe to TrueCrimeWeb so that you never miss another story. We will be back soon. Until then, take care of yourselves and look out for each other.